Hello and welcome to the second episode of the Rathwulven Talks podcast. I'm your host Ralph. Thanks a lot for tuning in, because today we will have a look at one of the biggest misconceptions in the bushcraft and survival community, in my opinion. And this is all going to be about this idea of survival that manifested itself in pop culture these days. And if you just bear with me, it will become apparent what I mean by that just throughout the entire episode. But just to start off, I would like to raise a statement, a hypothesis, and that is a very provoking one. It goes like this: you cannot practice survival. Yeah, sounds like a pretty untrue statement, right? You might think to yourself, but hey, I can go out, I can practice friction fires, I can practice gathering food, I can practice hunting with trapping systems like a figure 4 trap and these kind of things. That's all right, but can you really practice survival? I think we need to make a difference between actual survival scenarios and just simple survival skill training. And this is really important here. Listen carefully to how I'm phrasing this. We're talking about practicing survival skills, which is something completely different than actual survival scenarios. Let's just take a couple of examples, right? If you would go on YouTube and you find yourself some outdoor channel, you usually find these kind of 24-hour survival challenge type of videos, right? For example, the 24 hours with a knife only type of scenario, or maybe like a 72-hour bug out scenario. But what happens after people are actually pushing throughout that fixed period of time? Well, they usually abort their activity, they stop doing whatever they're doing, and then they go home. So by means of definition, they are not in a survival scenario. Just compare this to people surviving the Holocaust in World War II, or survivors of a plane crash that just end up somewhere in the middle of nowhere and have to wait for days, if not weeks, up until search and rescue gets them out. Many of these people don't even survive. A lot of people have died in comparable scenarios, right? So I think we need to understand that there is no such thing as practicing survival. You can practice skills, you can basically do some training in regards to different carving techniques and all these kind of things, and you can try to become proficient in these. But when it comes to real crisis scenarios, there's no possibility to practice for that, because let's say, for example, that you go out and for whatever reason your city is been nuked out of nowhere. That's kind of like the typical scenario that preppers would talk about, that there's some kind of doomsday scenario happening, and then you're just facing that circumstance. So what you gonna do? Can you really practice this kind of scenario? Can you go outdoors and practice a nuclear explosion? Well, the answer is no, right? So I think it is about time to develop a more realistic mindset when it comes to all these type of media content things that are thrown out into the internet and are just reposted and shared with people. Because again, proper survival knowledge can only be obtained throughout years of practice, first and foremost. I bet that none of the recreational bushcrafters or survivalists can ever compare his or her skill set with those of search and rescue teams in Alberta, for example. And it's really important to be aware that there's a difference between actual survival and what pop culture tells us to be survival, right? Let's just take another example, right? If we're looking at Les Stroud, amazing person. I really love his show. I love Survival Man. You can learn a lot of stuff from him because he kind of like keeps it real. But just think about this. He's going out there, he's doing some kind of demonstrations, and he does also have a backup team ready to get him out after 5 days if things go wrong. So what happens in those 5 days are scenarios that could be a real survival scenario, right? But it's not a real survival situation because it's also temporary. It does end whenever the respective person, in this case, Les Stroud, tells his crew to get him out, or if they just agree that after 5 days they will, call it quits and just leave it for that. So I think that we just have to accept that most of the videos or kind of like the blog articles and all the kind of things that you can find online, are nothing else but some kind of surface scratching type of pop culture, again, in the sense that it's written in an interesting way. It's almost kind of like infotainment. It tries to reach people and just make the story bigger than it actually is, if that makes sense, right? So yeah, the thing is, what can we do about this? Because again, most of the people that are going outdoors are doing so because they want to learn something about wilderness skills and survival. Well, this in itself is a great thing. Get me right here. I'm not arguing against practicing your boat roll technique, or I'm not arguing against improvised shelter building and all these kind of things, because the skills come in handy. But we need to look at them from a very realistic perspective. And that's also the reason why I personally like authors like Mors Kochanski or comparables more than I would ever like Bear Grylls or all these kind of showman folks that are just going on Discovery Channel and D-Max and whatever kind of channel comes to mind, just to give you that very, very aggressive and very, very showmanship-like boom type of survival, like this, yeah, we're going outdoors and now we are going to eat this dead rotten snake and now I'm just going to drink its blood, all these kind of things. It's way, way, way over top, and even worse, it's teaching newcomers and those that are not experienced with wilderness life, so to speak, wrong things. You're obtaining wrong information. You are learning about techniques that might eventually be fatal. And let me just give you an example. If you haven't seen the latest video on my YouTube channel, just go there and have a look at the Q&A video on the Rathwulven Bushcraft channel. I'm just gonna paraphrase the story that I was telling there shortly. So I was basically going outdoors into the Alps when I was 18, and we used to have this little woodchuck type of book from the Mickey Mouse magazine, just teaching kids about basic survival skills and kind of scouting and all these kind of things, right? And there was this one particular technique that was explaining how to carve a notch into a tree to mark waypoints for your route so you could find out of a forest. And to cut the long story short, when I was just 18 and having no experience, of course, with navigation and with proper survival, I kind of like got myself in a very, very bad situation, because I went out, I just kind of like took the hatchet, went into the forest, carved those notches in, and then at a point realized that I didn't do this on the way back, basically like on the other side of the trees. And needless to say, of course, like, it's a stupid idea anyway, because you're harming trees. So yeah, I found myself deep in some sort of forest without any orientation, just going in zigzag patterns and not knowing where I'm heading. And I had to spend 2 really horrible nights in the outdoors without any equipment. No fire starter kit, no lighter, no bottle of water, no blanket, no sleeping bag, no tent, and just naively trying to find my way back to the camp, because it's the initial reaction, you're trying to get out of that dire situation. And if it wasn't for search and rescue back in the days, I don't know what would have happened. And also, just to be really clear about this story, like, I'm not telling the story to brag about a cool survival experience, because it was one of the most horrible experiences that I ever had in my entire life. It wasn't fun, it was actually pretty frightening. And this is something that people need to understand, that survival as such is nothing that's in any way related to fun, that's in no way related to showing off. It's basically just trying to stay alive. That's what it means to survive, right? To just live another day. And it can get so incredibly horrible, because let's say, for example, you get lost somewhere in some Arctic terrain and you don't have any kind of GPS tracker and you don't have anything to eat and all these kind of things. You will just be in a bad situation. So I would hope for people to get this idea out of their head that survival is something cool, that is in any way comparable to a camp out or to some kind of adventure, because survival, by means of definition, has nothing to do with adventure. It only has to do with staying alive and struggling to do so. So yeah, that's why I think that you cannot practice survival. You can practice camping, you can practice building your tarp, you can practice building a tripod, you can do all of these things, but you will not be able to practice survival. That also said, another word about prepping, it's the same mechanism there. If people are trying to prepare for scenario X, for example, a famine, then they're storing food in their basement, but they're not prepared for any other kind of scenario. It's just for that very particular happening that they imagine in their head. Same thing for, let's say, for example, an economic breakdown and some issue with the gasoline supplies, for example. I mean, it's great if you have a couple of jerry cans in your basement, so you just got some spare gasoline, for sure. But again, this has nothing to do with survival. It's not a skill. It's just a preparation for one very particular scenario that you just try to imagine in your head, right? But there could be a completely different scenario, you know? It could be completely absurd and you can get hit by a tsunami. Well, if you don't have a boat and you're not sitting in that at this very moment, well, good luck swimming. I hope you know what I mean by that. I hope you can follow me in this thought. So what can we learn from this? Because in the end, you know, we all want to go out, we want to enjoy nature, we also want to take on adventures. And in order to do so, we need to obtain proper sets of skills, right? And I was asking myself, what can we do in order to become good survivalists, so to speak? And I think we just need to learn one single technique, or basically understand one simple fact. And that's that there is only one survival skill that needs to be mastered. And that's adaptability. I hope you're with me here. What does that mean, adaptability? Well, if we take the other examples that we talked about into consideration, so the prepper, for example, or whatever kind of doomsday scenario, then you're not adaptable if you just prepare to that specific situation. Adaptability is the exact opposite. You're not prepared for that. You're thrown into a really miserable scenario, but you can adapt and you can make the best out of it. And that's the big difference between, let's say, for example, survival and bushcraft training compared to prepping. And no offense to the preppers out there, because I know that a lot of bushcrafters also do engage in prepping, but by means of structure or by means of intention, both communities work into two completely different directions, right? Because the prepper is trying to prepare for a certain scenario. Maybe by having some sort of gas mask in the basement in case there's some ABC alarm out there. Or maybe has 20 kilos of potatoes ready in case that the supermarket supply crashes, and so on, and so on, and so on. Whereas the survivalist or the bushcrafter, in that case, doesn't even bother about storing or hoarding certain items back home, but experiences nature in a very pure form, if that makes sense, in a very Spartanic form. So if you go into, let's say, the boreal forest, and you lose your trail, then you take your hatchet or your axe or your knife and you start building yourself a shelter, right? You start to adapt because you don't want to get hypothermic. So you get busy in building a lean-to, for example. Next thing you do is building a fire. And if you don't have a lighter with you, or if you're not equipped with 20 matches, for example, then you have to know how to use a bow drill. If there's no proper material at hand for a bow drill, you need to be improvising. For example, you can find maybe like a cell phone battery in your cell phone after it died, and you got yourself a piece of aluminum foil from a chewing gum in your pocket, in your trouser. And then you can use this foil to bridge the two poles and hence create energy or warmth within that paper and make it burn, for example. It's one of the many techniques that you can learn. So again, you see that learning skills or learning techniques is important, but when it comes down to the respective scenario, you can't really predict this. So you need to be able to adapt and to switch your mind. Let's take water purification, for example. Let's say you get lost and you can't find yourself a creek, or at least a lake, that you could take water from, and it's bone dry, it's not raining. What you gonna do? Are you able to work with the principles of condensation? Can you harvest water from certain types of berries because you managed to identify a certain plant and can therefore squish out all the liquids in that berry or in that plant? What about digging into the ground? What about trying to get the groundwater levels up so you can scoop that water and start filtering that? All these questions are really, really important, because once you hit a certain type of scenario or some kind of problem and you get lost in the Alps, for example, then the digging for water kind of technique doesn't work, because you're just high up in the mountains, right? But then you might need to switch, and you might want to think about snow. You might want to think about maybe tying some scarf or a shemak or so around your foot and just walk through the grass if you're still kind of like on a level where there's still vegetation but no trees and such, so that you can gather the morning dew. And as you can see, all of these examples just show how incredibly important the principle of adaptability is. Surviving means adapting. Let's say that tomorrow there would be some kind of nuclear catastrophe. Then it's also about survival, and it will not only be about having enough rounds in your 9mm gun to protect yourself from all the other evil and scavenging people out there. That's the wrong approach, in my opinion. What you need to understand is that you need to be adaptable in any given scenario in a way that you can try to make a run for something, that you don't need to rely on your gear, that you always can move forward without actually having to rely on your bug out bag or to rely on your EDC kit. Having it is great. It's always better if you have gear with you than if you would need the gear, right? And I hope you're with me here, but the most important thing is happening in the head, because survival starts with your own psychology. If you want to become a proper survivor or a proper outdoors or woodsman or woman, then you really need to focus on your mindset. You need to be able to switch quickly. And let's just take another example. Like, let's say you're on a foraging hunt and you need to kind of like find something in a desert. How do you do this, and how would this turn out, compared to some forest or the Alps or the Balkan Mountains, or maybe the Yosemite Park, or maybe somewhere in Japan at the coastline? If you take a look at all these kind of scenarios, it really becomes apparent that every single situation needs some sort of adapting, right? You need to be able to switch quickly, to make proper decisions, and to basically minimize your risks. So it's also not about eating disgusting maggots or beetles, for example, or just eating that dead snake that you find somewhere, or doing whatever kind of other crazy stuff you see on Man vs. Wild. But instead, you need to be very proficient with your understanding of nature. You need to be proficient in mastering your psychology. You need to be proficient in mindfulness. You need to be able to be aware and look into the world with very, very open, but also analytical eyes, because you can always find a solution to your respective problem, okay? Just to take another example and to wrap it up, let's say you're out there without any type of knife. What can you do? If you need to cut something, maybe some cordage, well, you could crash some sort of flintstone to make yourself an improvised, almost prehistoric tool. But then again, you could also use kind of like certain types of bark of a tree. Basically, if it's really rough, you can just wrap your cordage around that and you can cut it by that. Maybe you can smash your glasses and thereby get yourself a makeshift blade. Maybe you can also try different things, for example, making a fire and then using a piece of coal to cut something. Just think out of the box. It's really important that if you want to become proficient in wilderness skills, you need to be creative. You need to have an open mind. You need to, just embrace all the possibilities that are out there rather than thinking in problems. And this also brings us back to the prepping community. The prepper expects a problem, right? He expects some sort of catastrophe, some sort of cataclysm. Whereas the more survival or bushcraft-like person thinks in possibilities. There's options out there, and I can choose which one to take. So I hope that makes sense, right? I would also say that I'm going to wrap it up for this episode because we're already getting close to 20 minutes. I hope you could learn something from that. If you got any thought to share, please do so. Leave a comment below. Let me know where this podcast should be going, because in the end, I'm doing this for you. If you think that these kind of topics are of interest, then I will go on about this. If you have any question, I can also address this. And yeah, up until then, I would just say make sure you subscribe for the upcoming episodes. If you're watching this on YouTube, then just click the subscribe button. If you're on SoundCloud, then just make sure you're going to follow the profile, right? Also make sure to check out all the other Rathwulven type of media, and maybe also register for the newsletter. I will put you a link in the description box on YouTube and also in the comment section on SoundCloud. Just register for the newsletter. It's for free. I'm going to send out weekly articles or weekly stories, or maybe even some kind of information about foraging and such. And please don't take it personally, if I'm not doing this every week, but I'm trying to keep up the pace, okay? I'm trying to do this at least once a week. Sometimes it might be every second week, depending on my own schedule. But it would be great, if you subscribe there and stay up to date with whatever's happening with the Rathwulven Bushcraft project, right? I would gladly appreciate this. And if at some point you want to leave, I also don't take that personally. You can always opt out. You can always unsubscribe. There's nothing that binds you in any way to this. And would be great to hear you in the next episode. So up until then, thanks a lot for listening. Have a great day. Enjoy your time outdoors and see you next time. Bye-bye.